One of the best video games I've played recently is a game by a bunch of young French developers called Clair Obscur Expedition 33. And the making of the game is a total underdog story of young people early in their careers who are just trying to start out, getting discovered, getting their first big break, and they get to work on the game, to write the music, to write for a game, and so on. But one of the most captivating parts of the game is its premise. There's a city called Lumiere, and across the sea from the city is a giant monolith and a giant woman called the Paintress. And each year, the Paintress paints a new number on the monolith, and everyone older than the year painted vanishes. They dissolve into flower petals and are blown away by the wind. And the Paintress has been counting down numbers for years. She originally started at like 100, and when the game begins, it's the day the number is changed from 34 to 33. So the oldest people then alive are 33, which is how old I am. And each year, the city sends out a new expedition team to cross the sea to try to stop the Paintress and to save the lives of everyone back home. And year after year, the expeditions have all failed. All the people who've gone across the sea have never been heard from again, and the numbers keep counting down. And the characters in the game face a difficult question of what they should do with their lives when they know exactly when they're going to die. Do they risk everything to join an expedition or focus on enjoying what time they know they have left? Is it ethical to have children when you know you won't live to see them grow up? What's worth spending your time on when who knows if anyone will be around much longer after you? What would it be like to know from a young age that you'd witness the deaths of everyone older than you? How would you cope with carrying that loss? Now, I wasn't surprised to learn that much of the game was written during the height of the pandemic because nothing made me contemplate my mortality quite like worrying if I would die of a new disease if I didn't sanitize all my groceries. But throughout the game, there's a sense of loss, melancholy, and also perseverance through loss that pervades much of the game. But the theme the game keeps coming back to again and again is the question of what's truly important when life and time is so limited. And this idea of figuring out what's truly valuable and lasting is precisely what Jesus is talking about in the gospel lesson from Luke. So last week we read where Jesus was teaching about money and possessions, and he's still on that theme this week. And just as a sneak peek for the gospel lessons coming up in the fall, Jesus is still going to be teaching about those things until we get into October. So money and possessions are one of the most common things for Jesus to preach about, and it puts Jesus in good company with the prophets of the Old Testament, who also bring that up repeatedly. And when you think about it, it makes sense that the Bible talks a lot about money and possessions because those two things have a huge role in our lives. Each day, each one of us interacts with money and possessions, and oftentimes we even use our money to get more possessions. So talking about money and possessions is talking about daily life. So the gospel lesson has two but distinct and related sections. So the first part is about selling our possessions and giving to the poor. And the second part is a warning about being active doing the work God has commanded us because we don't know the time when Christ is going to return. And when Christ does return, we should be found busy doing the work that he's called us to do rather than being found asleep. Now we're going to start with the first section, and the key verse in that first section is, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." What Jesus is getting at is that what we invest in shows where our hearts are. What we spend money on or put our effort into shows what we truly value. There's a sense here of that phrase, "you are what you eat," but in this case, it's more the sense that we are what we invest in. One of the ways to think of a budget, whether it's our own personal budget or the budget of the government or the budget of any organization we're part of, is to view a budget as a moral document. What a budget puts money towards is saying what our values are. If we talk a good game about something like Christian values but aren't willing to spend money to help the poor or feed the hungry, then our heart isn't actually for Christian values. If something is truly important to us, if our heart is truly for something, our time and our treasure will be invested there. And for many of us, we store up treasures for ourselves. For a rainy day, we store up treasures because we're told that we're somehow deficient if we don't buy this thing or that. We pursue wealth because we're told that this is the way to be happy. We convince ourselves that everything is okay so long as the people we care most about are taken care of. We've been convinced that we can buy security, safety, and predictability. But the result of setting our hearts on money and possessions is often our hearts end up focused inward and filled with fear. If what we ultimately value is accumulating wealth and possessions, then fear makes sense. Jesus even points out that purses wear out, thieves can break in and steal, moths can destroy. If our hearts are set on the treasure of this world, all those things are fleeting, fallible, and bound for death. When our hearts are focused on the material things of this world, we're prone to falling for rhetoric, demonizing this group or that because we're afraid that they're going to take something from us. Our hearts are scared we don't have enough, that everything around us is scarce, and it's about me getting what's mine. When our hearts are set on material things, we're setting ourselves up for fear, anxiety, and misery. When Jesus tells the parable about slaves waiting for their master to return, he's emphasizing the uncertainty that's part of life. And the uncertainty he names directly is that none of us know when Christ will return to bring heaven to earth and also bring about final judgment. So we ought to be living our lives like that return is going to happen at any time. But not dissimilar to that potential worry about Christ returning is the uncertainty that comes with being human and being mortal. Even in our modern world with all of our technology and medicine, we are still very mortal. I've sat in the pew of a church and received the shocking news that my former Sunday school teacher had terminal cancer and would die before he reached 60. As a pastor, I've been the one giving the church news of someone dying unexpectedly. And many of us here have experienced the death of someone we know and love that was unexpected. And as an old hymn says, time like an ever-flowing stream bears all its sons away. None of us really know what tomorrow will bring. Will Christ come on clouds descending? Will we see our lives cut short by a freak accident, a natural disaster, a health condition? What would it look like if we actually lived each day like it would be our last? Being faced with our mortality has a way of making us examine what's actually important. When all the chips are down, where have we invested our treasure? What do we have to show for our lives? In the game I was talking about at the beginning of the sermon, Clair Obscur, I mentioned, in the game that I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon, one of the recurring lines that the characters say to help find motivation and hope when those things are hard to find is they say the line, "For those who come after." And that's a declaration of hope that there will indeed be people who come after. And it's also an affirmation that what we do for others is what's really important. The characters are giving everything they have for the potential people of the future. In a similar vein, there's also St. Lawrence. So St. Lawrence was one of the 7 deacons serving the church in Rome in the 3rd century, and he was the church treasurer and probably what we'd today call the church facilities chairman. And in 257, the Roman emperor started a wave of persecution against the church, and all the church property was seized, and people were banned from gathering for worship. And on August 4th, 258, the Bishop of Rome and 6 deacons were at a cemetery where they'd gathered to worship in secret. However, they were discovered, arrested, and executed, and then buried back in the cemetery where they'd been found. The Romans were very efficient. However, they held off on executing Lawrence because the emperor wanted Lawrence to give him all of the church's money. And so Lawrence was tortured and tortured to reveal the location of the treasury, and finally he agrees to their demands. However, Lawrence says everything is scattered about the city in multiple locations, so he needs 3 days to gather everything together. And the emperor and the officials sign off on this plan because they're excited, because they think this is going to be a lot of money. So Lawrence has 3 days. And during that time, he gathers up all the money of the church, and then he turns around and he gives it away to all the poorest people of Rome. And he then gets a crowd together of all the lepers, the widows, the orphans, the blind, and the lame, all the poor of the city. And when the emperor shows up, excited to get his hands on the church's treasure, Lawrence brings the emperor to where all the poor and marginalized people of Rome are gathered, and Lawrence says, "Here is the treasure of the church." And as you might imagine, the emperor was not pleased, and Lawrence was then martyred on August 10th, and he was just 33 years old. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What Jesus is calling us to do in this passage is to reorient ourselves to what really matters. What's powerful about St. Lawrence is that when he realized his time was limited, he took his limited time to invest everything he had in what's truly most valuable. He realized his possessions, just like his life, are gifts from God, and the most faithful thing he could do was use all that he had and all that he was for what matters most to God. He gave everything to God and for the people who came after him. When we invest in what truly matters to God, our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, family, friends, neighbors, the well-being of all God's people, we're investing in something infinitely valuable, the treasure of heaven, which can never run out. We'll have put all of our treasure in the storehouse of the kingdom, the storehouse of God's abundant grace, which can never be stolen, lost, or exhausted. Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Christ has come to give us the peace of his kingdom. And when our worth and security is backed by the treasure of heaven, we're built on a firm foundation and have no need to fear the storms and uncertainties of life. And then maybe at the last, when our number comes up, we'll rest secure in the knowledge that the treasure of our lives and the desires of our hearts are exactly where they need to be, with Christ, who is Lord of both the dead and the living. Amen.